Redditors, what is the absolute creepiest thing that has happened to you that you can't tell anyone because they wouldn't believe you? I was out for a walk early one morning in a forest preserve that's usually pretty empty. As I came around a corner, I noticed a car parked in the grass just outside of a parking lot. I thought it was strange but kept walking. I was probably about 50 feet away from the car when, suddenly, the trunk popped open, the car alarm started blaring, and the driver's side door swung open. I was approaching from the passenger side and couldn't see the driver, but I immediately got a bad feeling about the situation. I kept walking along the path and came around to the driver's side of the car. There was a guy sitting in the driver's seat, and he waved me over, throwing his hands up, saying, "I'm not sure what's going on. Could you come help me?" Without breaking my stride, I told him, "Nah, you're on your own," and kept moving. He threw his hands up again, turned off the car alarm, got out, shut the trunk, and then drove away. Feeling creeped out, I waited until he was out of sight before doubling back and walking the opposite way, just to be safe. I walked back for about 30 minutes, heading toward the lot where I had parked my car. As I got close, I heard that same car alarm going off again. Now I was freaking out, but I didn't want to go back into the woods, so I kept going toward the parking lot. When I arrived, I saw that the same car was parked there, with its trunk open, car alarm going off, and the driver's door wide open. The guy was already talking to someone else in the parking lot. He saw me enter the lot, looked at me for a moment, then turned off the car alarm, closed the trunk, and drove away again. I didn't waste any time. I booked it to my car and called the park rangers, but they didn't think anything was weird about it. I'm like 90% sure that guy was trying to kidnap someone. Several years back, on a bright winter afternoon, I decided to take my nephew, then 7, my son, then 3, and my dog on a short hike at a local park. We were walking through the woods on a trail when my dog started barking. I looked over and saw a man standing in the woods, about 50 feet away, facing us. I couldn't see his face because he had one of those fur-lined hoods on. Between the distance, the shadows from the trees, and his hood, from my perspective, there was nothing but a black hole where his face should have been. I gave an awkward wave, but he remained motionless. I had a weird feeling, so I decided to keep moving, making our way back to the car. I felt like we were being watched, so I looked back a few minutes later. The man was still just standing in the woods, but I knew he had moved because he was still about 50 feet away, even though we had walked quite a distance. My dog was growling, and the kids and I were starting to get creeped out. We kept moving, and suddenly, I heard the sound of fast, heavy footsteps in the snow. I looked back again, and this time, I caught the guy running in our direction. He stopped as soon as I saw him and went back to just staring motionlessly from afar, now closer than he was before. My dog was going nuts at this point, and my mind was racing with possibilities. I discreetly gave my nephew my phone and quietly told him that if anything happened, he needed to take his cousin and run as fast as they could to the car and call for help. I figured, if nothing else, the dog and I could at least hold the guy off long enough for the kids to get away. I think my dog may have scared him off because he ended up turning around and going in the opposite direction. I've never really told anyone because I don't want to come off as being dramatic. One night when I was 15, I stayed over at my buddy's house. His parents were gone, and his older brother was looking after us. When we went to bed, the house was quiet and dark. I could barely see his bedroom door, which was open slightly, and I assumed it was my buddy's brother checking in on us. But then I realized that the person looking in on us was wearing glasses, and my friend's brother did not. There was no one else in the house, and I couldn't figure out who this person was. I was frozen in fear, just staring at the figure peeking in. That's when my buddy, who was in another bed on the other side of the room, started screaming at the top of his lungs. I had never heard a more terrifying sound, and my heart just dropped out of my chest. The person looking at us quickly backed out, and the door quietly closed. A few seconds later, we saw the hallway light come on, and my friend's brother burst through the door, asking what was wrong. We both started yelling that someone had just been there. The brother grabbed a baseball bat from his room and started searching the house. We checked the front and back doors, as well as the garage, but they were all locked. Every window was closed. He looked in every closet and under the beds. Needless to say, we spent the rest of the night in his room. None of us could sleep, so we stayed up talking all night. It was one of the most terrifying yet best nights of my life. I drove an old SUV back in college. After school, I drove home, which was about a 30-minute drive. While I was getting dressed at home, the car alarm went off, so I rushed outside and discovered the car door open, with the radio head unit and all the speakers gone. I thought, this guy works fast. I reported it to the police, and after a couple of weeks, they found the thief and asked me to come to the police station. At the police station, I was asked a few questions, and the officer told me I had to hear something from the thief. When I confronted him, he told me that he was able to get into my car in the parking lot near my school, and when I unexpectedly arrived, he dove into the third row and lay flat. So, I had unknowingly driven home with an unwanted passenger the entire time. When I arrived home and locked the car, that's when he removed the items. And when he opened the door, the alarm was triggered. I once dated a man who claimed he was haunted by a demon or evil spirit. Weird stuff would happen around him, like he'd leave all the drawers and cabinet doors in his kitchen open. I'd come to his apartment and find all of them open, and he'd be in his bedroom. When I asked about it, he'd say he didn't remember leaving them open. I thought he was just messing with me. Then I started to have nightmares when I stayed over. Once, I dreamed a creature was hovering over him. It looked like a black sheet or a dementor. It was trying to smother him, and I screamed myself awake. Another time, when we were sitting in the living room, he said he felt it nearby, and I heard a guttural growling sound. We were alone, and he didn't make the noise. I was so scared that I told him we should stay at my apartment that night. He said it was tied to him and would just follow him. When we got to my place, I told my roommate about the situation. She was open-minded about it, and we sat up talking for a while. At one point, he and I went to lie down in my bed. He told me he could feel it nearby. My skin started to get goosebumps, and I felt this overwhelming fear. We decided to go back into the living room with my roommate because it felt safer. While they were talking, I went outside to my patio for a smoke to calm myself a bit. I wasn't a superstitious person, so all of this was getting to me. Plus, I hadn't been sleeping much. While I sat outside, there was a lightning storm. No rain yet, but the sky flickered, and the wind started blowing in big gusts. I began to feel angry, like, how dare this thing come to my house? In my mind, I challenged the creature to appear. I dared it to. I was calling it out in my head. The storm was coming, and I decided to go back inside, feeling upset and angry. I put my cigarette out in a small glass ashtray on the patio. As I pushed the butt down, the ashtray split perfectly into 3 pieces. 3 perfect triangles. I know I didn't push hard enough to break it. Right then, thunder and lightning crashed really hard. I scooped up the broken ashtray pieces and ran back inside to show my boyfriend and roommate. I was so freaked out by everything at that point that I couldn't process it. The next day, he called his aunt in Mexico. She told him to get a small mirror and look into it while calling out to the spirit. She said to break the mirror when he saw or felt the demon, and then to bury the pieces where no one would find them. He did it, apparently, and there were no more problems after that. Freaking weird. I don't know if it was all nonsense to this day, but I will never forget how I felt when that ashtray broke. It was like the bad spirit was taunting me back. Last winter, I was driving down the freeway at night, going between suburbs of a large metropolitan area. There were plenty of cars around, but it was close to midnight, and it had been snowing. The snow wasn't covering everything, which is common in winter here. I noticed a car pulled over on the shoulder of the freeway, with a guy standing next to it, clearly in need of assistance. I saw him as I was driving past, and since it was late at night and cold, I figured I might as well take the next exit, loop around, and see if he still needed help. When I got there, I saw a middle-aged, working-class guy standing outside his pickup. He was wearing blue overalls, slender, slightly balding, and gave off what I can only describe as a strange vibe. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was one of those gut feelings that something wasn't right. He explained that he had been having car troubles, was from about 2 hours out of town, and that his alternator was shot, causing his battery to die. Having owned a car with a bad alternator before, I knew that a boost was necessary to get the battery running again. I told him it was no problem, and sympathized with him for a moment. I popped my hood, and he said he was going to grab his cables. When he returned, I noticed he had something metal in his hand, though it wasn't a knife. It was shorter than the length of his hand, and he was clearly trying to conceal it. This all happened quickly, and I immediately went on high alert. I saw it for just a brief moment as he approached with the cables, and I instinctively stepped back to put some distance between us. I told him he could hook up the battery while I waited in the car, ready to defend myself in case he tried anything. He didn't make any moves, though, and began connecting the cables to my battery as I sat inside my car. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the object was just something he had with the cables, and I had misread the situation. After a few minutes, he tried to start his car but shouted that it wasn't working. He walked back toward my car and stood in front of it. After waiting a few more minutes, he went back to fiddle with the cables under my hood. I kept a close watch on him, still spooked, making sure he didn't approach my window. He yelled again that it wasn't working, and asked me to come take a look. I rolled my window down slightly and casually told him not to worry, that it might just take some time. Fortunately, I could see my battery through the gap in the popped hood, directly in front of me. I watched him as he fiddled with the cables again, and then I saw him pull out the metal object from earlier. He touched it to my battery terminal, causing sparks to fly. He yelled and jumped back, and I immediately got out of my car. I told him something had come up and that I needed to leave right away. I can't remember what he was trying to say because I cut him off, repeating that I had to go. I didn't take my eyes off him for even a second. I'm not sure how the cables came off my battery, whether I pulled them off or if they were already disconnected. But I slammed the hood shut, jumped into my car, and drove off. To this day, I still have no idea what his plan was. I don't know what he was trying to do, but I'm certain that whatever he was doing wasn't what he was telling me. As I drove away, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I can't stress enough how weird the guy's vibe was, like something out of The Hills Have Eyes. Maybe he was trying to short my battery so I'd be stuck there. I still wonder if I encountered some kind of serial killer, waiting for someone to stop and help. Who knows? All I know is that it freaked me out, and I got away from him as fast as I could. I still wish I had gotten a license plate number to give to the police, but in that moment, the only thing I could think of was getting out of there as fast as possible. One night when I was about 13, I was visiting my dad for the weekend. You know, the kind of visit divorced parents arrange. In the middle of the night, we got a phone call, and I knew that a call at that time was never a good thing. My dad answered it, and I heard him whispering. I knew right then. This was not good news. That's when I noticed the red and blue cop lights swirling outside the window. The next thing I knew, my dad came into the room I shared with my sisters. The strange part was that he was squatting down low. He saw I was awake. Since I was the oldest, he told me what was going on. He whispered, "I need you to help me wake your sisters and keep them calm." That was the police. There's a man outside on the street with a gun, and we're being evacuated. At this point, my heart was racing. I remember it pounding in my ears, beating so hard. The cops had told us to keep the lights off, stay away from the windows, and stay low. So, I helped my dad wake my two younger sisters. We played it off like a game, staying near the floor as we put on our winter boots and coats. It was below freezing outside. The next part was the hardest. We kept things vague with my sisters because we had to go out the back and down 2 flights of outdoor stairs as quietly as possible. When we stepped out the door, I was terrified. Being out in the open felt 10 times worse. My mind started imagining how bad it would hurt to get shot before I died. What if I had to watch my sisters or my dad get shot? But I couldn't let any of that show, so my sisters wouldn't be as scared as I was. We met the cops at the bottom of the stairs. They told us to leave the area on foot. My dad asked, "Where?" They just shrugged, so we headed to a 24-hour burger place a few blocks away. Once we got far enough, I felt so relieved. We sat in that burger joint, drinking cocoa and sleeping on the benches with a few other evacuees. It was hours. Long story short, a crazy method-out guy with a gun was standing in front of my dad's house, so we had to evacuate. We sat in the burger joint for over 4 hours, and I experienced my first existential crisis at 13. I was on a bike ride with my friends through an apartment complex. We had been there about 5 times and knew the area quite well. However, there were 2 strange things about it. First, there was a man who always had his phone to his face, like he was on speaker. But he never said anything. He would watch us as we biked past. When he noticed a spot we usually rode through, he would stand in our way, literally walking to where we rode and blocking us. This may have been because we were riding BMX street style, but I don't think that was the reason. One day, we got split up. One friend was with me, and the other was on his own. We rode around looking for our missing friend, but we couldn't find him. Eventually, he came biking toward us, fast. We slowed down and asked him where he had been. He said a guy had been following him in a truck. He was pretty shaken up, and someone called the police. When they arrived, they couldn't find the truck. No one thought to mention the man with the phone. We never saw the man or the truck again. After that, we never went back to the complex. I don't remember this, but it involves me. I would have been maybe a year old. I was asleep in the nursery, and my parents were awake in bed, talking before going to sleep. Suddenly, they heard an adult voice loudly say, "Shh," from the nursery. Both of them bolted up out of bed and rushed into the nursery to find me awake, but thankfully alone. They never told anyone because who would believe it? There was also an incident with my mom around that same time. My dad had just gotten up at around 5 a.m. to go to work, and she was in bed, deciding whether to get up or sleep a bit more. She decided to get up, and as she stepped out of bed, someone reached out from under the bed and grabbed her foot hard. She immediately pulled herself back up on the bed and was frozen there in fear for some time, waiting for someone to speak, make the bed move, or start crawling out from under it. Whatever it was. Eventually, she flew out the door, grabbed me, and then a weapon. But when she worked up the courage to go back to their room and look, there was, of course, no one there. Again, my parents never told anyone because it sounds crazy. I tend not to believe in ghosts or spirits, but these are freaky stories. Right around high school graduation, I was sitting in the living room at 1 or 2 a.m. when I saw headlights and heard a thud. I cracked the front door, and there was a car outside. It appeared as though they might have hit my truck. As I started to open the door, they sped off. I checked the truck the following morning, but nothing looked obviously damaged. I went to work at my cashier job, and my coworkers were talking about an armed robbery and a taxi driver who was killed with a handgun overnight. Pretty scary, I thought. About a month later, one of my mom's friends, who happened to work for the county, asked me to look at my truck very closely and call her if I found anything. I told her later that, after closer inspection, there was a small crack in the plastic trim around the driver's side taillight, and I informed her about the car that probably caused it. She explained to me that detectives had arrested a group of teenagers while investigating the cabbie murder, and during the interviews, they mentioned stealing a car and bumping into a truck while joyriding before robbing a gas station at gunpoint and killing a taxi driver. About 2 weeks ago, my wife and I had friends over, and someone mentioned a Facebook story about a cabbie getting robbed at gunpoint. Someone else mentioned the killing, so I shared my story. My wife then added that we both could have died that night because she was the gas station clerk who got robbed. I knew that something bad happened to her around that time, and that she never talked about it much. It's such a scary and odd coincidence to me that, before we were ever together, we were in the path of the same violent crime spree. I was a case manager for mental health, SMI members. My clinic helped cover some of the most rural areas connected to my city. It could be a 30 to 60-minute drive out into the desert to visit someone's trailer for a home visit, with instructions like, "Turn at the cactus," or "We are the only trailer in that direction. You can't miss me." Anyway, I went for a home visit for a member who was not my usual client. I had never met this person before. It was a long drive out there. The cell signal dropped a few times, and there were no street signs. The works. I arrived at the house, and the member was waiting on the porch for me. This wasn't unusual. He commented on my young age and appearance, which was also not unusual. I had just graduated college and was younger than most of the members. It was a common comment they all made. Anyway, we went inside the trailer, making small talk about the weather or the clinic, just casual conversation while walking in. Then, he locked the door behind me, like deadbolted it. I asked him to unlock the door, and he refused, stating symptoms of paranoia. Okay, not ideal. So I stood with my back to the door, arms reached from the lock, and continued with my home visit. How foolish am I, despite feeling extremely uncomfortable. I asked him how he liked living way out there. He smiled and said, "It's great. Very quiet. No neighbors to see what you're doing. Isolated. Creepy." I asked if he had emergency phone numbers on hand, 911, crisis hotline, the clinic, the pharmacy, etc. He laughed but confirmed. However, this was a laugh meant to put me on edge. So I asked why he was laughing. Why did I need to know? He said, "It takes 911 between 30 to 45 minutes to get here if you can make a call out. Lots of stuff can happen in that time." Now I was really freaking out, trying to professionally end this appointment as quickly as possible. And then I heard it. A faucet running in another room. "Does somebody else live here?" I asked. He smiled and shook his head. "Nope, all by myself." I heard a drawer open and close, followed by some footsteps. "Is someone else here?" His expression changed. "I said there isn't anybody here. Nobody you want to meet." I know it sounds straight out of the Zodiac movie, but I would swear on my life and everyone I love that it occurred. I thanked him for his time and told him his regular case manager would follow up as I was unlocking the door, still facing him. He said, "It was nice to have a female visit. They usually send a male to work with me." With this smile, a smile I'll never forget. On the walk, really sprinting in heels, to the car, I pulled out my cell phone. No service. I didn't have cell service until 5 minutes down the road. I no longer conduct home visits. I also started wearing flat shoes, baggy clothing, and a breakaway lanyard. I shared my location with everyone and bought an Apple Watch for the SOS feature. I was really a wreck after that, and no one believed me. My clinic leadership and peers laughed, saying they never had a problem with this member. They stated he was safe and harmless, telling me I was making it up because I was young and naive. Some of my friends didn't believe me because of the similarities with the Zodiac movie. I swear on everything that I hold dear that it happened. It terrified me, and it changed the course of my career forever. I often had trouble sleeping as a child, and would wake up in the middle of the night, going to my parents' room to sleep. I was a very paranoid and sensitive child, constantly thinking there was someone at the foot of my bed or lurking in the dark corners of my room. One time, and I still swear to this day, something, or someone, yanked my sheets off me during the night, waking me up. I sat up, but I couldn't see anything. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. I spent the whole night looking around, waiting for it to happen again so I could catch whoever or whatever was doing it. I was 8 or 9 years old at the time. This would happen often, with the sheets being pulled off me, or at least that's how I experienced it. It went on for years. One time, after it happened again, I crossed the hallway between my parents' bedroom and mine, and there was this bright, blinding light shining from outside the window. That image is still stuck in my head, but I don't remember anything after seeing that light. I just remember the light. I got married too young, 21, and then divorced when I was 23. A few months went by, and I started having these nightmares. Long story short, a girl in a white dress with brown hair matted with leaves and dirt walks into my house, tracking muddy footprints. She stops and stares at the attic stairs, which are down for some reason. I ask her why she's there. She screams, and the whole house crumbles. I never saw her face. I had this nightmare almost every night for 3 months, and when I say almost every night, I mean probably 95% of the time. For some reason, I started sleeping in my living room instead of the bedroom. I just wasn't very comfortable in there. So, I'm sleeping on my couch one night and wake up around 2 a.m. for no reason. I check my phone and see I have a text from my friend and respond. Important because it verifies I was awake. I started getting very uncomfortable, and then I heard a knock at my door. I walk around and peek out the window, and there's a girl there. I can't see anything other than her white hoodie, which is up, and long dark hair coming out of it. She knocks, then knocks again. Not urgently or anything, but she didn't appear intent on leaving. So, stupidly, in retrospect, looking back on this as a 34-year-old, I crack open the door. In a quiet voice, she asks if she can use my cell phone. I still can't really see her face because my porch light was out, and I'd been putting off changing the bulb for no reason at all. I ask if everything's okay, and she just repeats she needs to use the phone. Again, against my better judgment, I put my cell phone to the dial screen and hand it to her. I see her hit a few things, then put the phone to her ear, and the screen light gave me a better view of her face. She was younger, somewhere between 18 and 22. Plain, not really particularly distinguishing in any way. She waits for a minute, then says, "Hey, I need help. I need your help." "Yeah. Okay." Then she hands me the phone again. So, I look at my phone, and it's still on the dial screen. Something felt weird to me, so I clicked over to the recent calls, and she hadn't called anyone. When I looked up, she was gone. Not quite vanished, but way down the street, farther than anyone should have been able to cover in that time frame, walking away. After that, the nightmares stopped. Potentially related, 2 months later, I got a call from a friend late at night, maybe around 10 p.m., who was like, "Hey, want to come over for a beer?" I wasn't doing anything, so I did. I got back around 1 a.m., and my house had been broken into. It was totally trashed, with a bunch of valuables gone. I certainly don't think my friend had anything to do with that, but I do sometimes wonder if that girl was casing my house that night. It's the only correlation I can make between the dream-stopping and real-world explanations for that weird experience. The whole thing was just super weird. This didn't happen to me, but to my parents. My mom going off the deep end on a crazy train isn't out of character, but my dad doesn't do that ever, and he swears the story is legit. When I was around 2, my mom woke up from a nightmare and woke my dad up. He tried going back to sleep, but she told him not to because his mom was going to call soon, as someone had been decapitated in some kind of accident. My dad, of course, thought this was nonsense, but my mom was hysterical about it, so he couldn't sleep. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the phone was ringing. It was his mom, letting him know that his friend and the friend's little brother's girlfriend had both died in a car crash coming home from a party about 3 miles away from us. My dad's mom and their family were very close. My grandma, my dad's mom, I shouldn't have to explain, but it's getting a bit all over the place. And the mother from that family were lifelong friends and died just 6 months or so apart. Anyway, I later learned that my dad's friend had been decapitated when he lost control in his ragtop Camaro, hit a tree, flipped the car upside down, and slid a ways down the road. Neither he nor his younger brother's girlfriend were wearing seatbelts. This would have been back in maybe 1981. As a kid, my parents converted half of our garage into a room for me so that I could have my own space and not share a room. But right as I moved in, there were these fast crawling noises that raced along my walls. It kept me up for hours through the night. Loud scratching sounds and quick movements throughout every wall in the room. I told my parents, and they had an exterminator come to see if any animals had somehow gotten in. The guy said there was absolutely nothing. No signs of anything that could be making this noise. My parents called me crazy and said I wasted their time. The night the exterminator came, I woke up to a loud bang on my wall. When I opened my eyes, there was something in the corner of my room watching me. I went under the covers and tried not to acknowledge it until I passed out. I didn't even bother telling my parents about that. A lot of people don't believe me, so I don't really tell it anymore. When I was about 15, I went to Virginia with my mom and dad to see one of my sisters. She was in the Navy and stationed at Norfolk. She had a baby a few months prior, and we went to meet her. Because we were in Virginia, and I was fascinated with history, I wanted to visit the historic towns of Jamestown and Williamsburg. So, on the second day we were there, we went to Williamsburg. My sister told us about one of the churches where the founding fathers would sit, and I wanted to go in. It was very neat and nicely air-conditioned. It was 102 degrees with 100% humidity, LOL. After we left the church, there were gravestones that my mom and I went to look at. While we were standing there, probably about 2 minutes at that point, I started feeling a tightness around my neck. The tightness kept getting stronger, and at that point, I was starting to suffocate. I looked at my mom, who looked like the wind had been knocked out of her. She eventually managed to push me, and I grabbed her, and we both managed to break free of whatever it was. After we caught our breath, she noticed I had redness around my neck. When she got a closer look, she saw a full handprint. She immediately took a picture and showed it to me, and it was a handprint, a very large handprint. She proceeded to take a picture with my hand over the handprint, and this handprint was so large that I couldn't match it. After my dad and brother-in-law came over and saw the redness around my neck, my dad immediately asked why I had redness on my neck. I told him, but he didn't believe me. Not only did I put my hand over the handprint to show him, but he did the same, and even his hand was smaller. He, of course, told me and my mom that nothing had happened, and we proceeded to leave. My mom took a quick snapshot of the graveyard before we did. When we looked back at the photos later, we noticed a silhouette by a tree that was near the gravestone where we were looking at. Mind you, this was all in broad daylight. After a few days, we got back home and showed my older sister the pictures. She believed us. She was the only one. My brothers didn't. A day after we settled, my mom downloaded the pictures on the computer. The next day, we went to look at all the pictures, but those pictures of my neck and the graveyard were completely gone. My mom's camera at the time held photos for 2 weeks before they were permanently deleted. When we went to look for the photos on her camera, at that point, 6 days later, they were also gone. She tried to download the pictures again, but those images were permanently lost. Mom and I only have the memories, but when I tell people, most think it's a made-up ghost story. I can tell you it was real, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. The day after Easter in 1972. We were off from school, and to this day, I have no explanation. When I was 15, my older brother and I were hanging out in the yard. Our dad was a very unique person, and we lived in a rural area. To our surprise, we both saw Dad walking up the long driveway to our house around 10 in the morning. We wondered what had happened since he left for work in his car around 7. My brother went inside to tell Mom. We were curious. He was wearing the same clothes he had on that morning. It was him. No way it could be anyone else, and the closest houses were at least a quarter mile away. I started to walk out to meet him, and as I was maybe 100 feet away, I called out. The next thing I knew, he wasn't there. I thought he somehow fell into the culvert. Nothing. I searched, and my brother came to help. Mom and my sister came out, and we covered the area for maybe half an hour. Nothing. Mom suggested we give Dad a call at work. He answered the phone right away, and Mom, in a lighthearted manner, asked him if he'd been home in the last hour. He worked as a civilian on a military post about 25 miles away. Mom put my brother on the phone, and then me. He denied he'd been home. We asked him again when he came home, and he seemed irked, insisting we were mistaken and had no explanation. I remember about 10 years later bringing this up, and he became upset, saying I was playing a mind game. I'm the only person in this account who's still alive. To this day, I have no idea what my brother and I experienced. I know it was him. I know he was there, and then he wasn't. I guess it's just one of those things. In 2011, my family and I were at Darien Lake in upstate New York on a roller coaster called the Ride of Steel, like Superman. On the track, there were 2 trains, with about 8 cars per train. They seated 2 people across and had lap restraints. I was on train 2, which was at the station. While getting in, I looked out at the coaster and thought I saw a falling blob just after the second major drop. I shook it off, as I wear glasses and my vision is still poor. Well, we went around the track and stopped just before the station. We waited and waited, and my family wondered what was happening. We saw the car in front of us still occupied by the riders, with an empty wheelchair next to one of the cars. It was a packed ride, with long wait lines. Every seat was full except one in the car next to the wheelchair. After waiting about 15 minutes, they finally let everyone off, but kept the train in the station. After about another 15 minutes, they sent the train, and we pulled into the station. The ride attendants were in shock and didn't talk to anyone. Later, we talked to some of the waiting guests who were in line to ride the Ride of Steel. They said a man had fallen out. I witnessed the death of a guy on a roller coaster and didn't even realize it. The man who died was an Iraq veteran, a double amputee who was missing one leg and most of the other. He flew out of the lap bar because he had no legs. To this day, people do not believe me when I tell this story, and my family barely believes me, as I was only 12 at the time. I was never really afraid of gore and death, but in that moment, there was a feeling, knowing you witnessed someone's last moments alive. That feeling is indescribable. My cross-country team and I went to Yosemite about 17 years ago. The girls and boys slept in 2 large separate tents. I didn't know the sleeping accommodations prior to the trip, so my grandma got me a little tent of my own. There were quite a few people in the area, so it's not like we were isolated or anything like that. I never slept well, even in my younger years, and quite a few things happened during our 1-week stay. One instance involved a bear walking by my tent, and another was the sound of a woman screaming. The girls in the tent heard it too. But one night in particular, I heard splashing and rustling in the lake where we were camping. I figured it was another bear or something unusual. So, I got my flashlight to see what it might be. A somewhat unsafe idea, maybe, now that I think of it. I pointed it in the direction of the sound, and saw what looked like a person, but not quite like a person. It was unclothed and small, but not built like a child. It, or they, ran behind the trees. I immediately went back into my tent, and didn't see anything else like that for the rest of the trip. As a child, I spent weekends at my dad's house, which was old and said to be haunted by a playful girl named Esther. For other people, doors would shut themselves, lights would turn on and off, and doorbells would ring in the middle of the night. My siblings would even have conversations with Esther. Understanding this as a 6-year-old absolutely terrified me. Pretty soon, I had my own experiences, but they were less friendly. I'd hear breathing in the dark, and I would stop breathing to listen. It was much closer to me than my stepbrother in the bunk above me. I'd wake to the imprint of someone sitting on the end of the bed, breathing. Reading other stories of sleep paralysis sounds familiar to my experience, but one night, I challenged my night terror. I had 2 die-cast race cars on my dresser. Both hoods opened on the cars, but one didn't stay up very well. I said out loud, "If you're here, shut the hood when I go to bed," and opened the hood of the car that had the better functioning hood. I stared at it to make sure it was up and stayed up. I hit the lights, and as soon as I lay down, slam. I turned the lights on. The hood was closed. I ran downstairs. My stepmother said I looked white as a sheet, like I'd seen a ghost. She and my dad checked it out and came to the conclusion that it just shut on its own. The weirdness continued until they moved out, but I still have trouble believing it myself or typing it out. This happened in Sydney, Australia, around 2016. I was about 14 years old, and there was an abandoned house on the corner of my suburban street. It wasn't like your typical 100-year-old decaying house. It was fairly modern and had been abandoned fairly recently after an old lady passed away, I think. My two friends, let's call them Jackson and Harley, and I used to walk past it on our way home from school, and on one occasion, being the mischievous teens that we were, we thought we'd jump the fence and check out the house. We managed to make our way into the house through a broken side window. I remember that Harley found a screwdriver and removed the lock from the back door so we could get in and out that way. Whoever lived in this house had obviously been a hoarder. It was your classic case of newspapers and letters stacked up in the living room. We searched through several of the rooms, and Jackson and I snagged some old jewelry that we found. There was also a basement that was a bit dusty and filled with old kids' toys and similar items. We didn't go down there much as it smelled pretty bad and was just kind of unpleasant in general. From then on, it became a regular thing for us to enter the house after school and just hang out, looking around at all the old stuff. It was never overly creepy or anything, but it did have an unsettling feeling about it. There were picture frames of people I didn't know on the walls, and seeing these random faces smiling down at me always made me feel a bit uneasy, especially since we were technically infiltrating this home. There were a few occasions when I would walk home from school alone because my friends had other activities, or I was coming back late. I never worked up the courage to enter the house alone, but I would often stare up at the kitchen window from the side path, half expecting to see some ghostly figure staring back down at me. One day, Jackson and his family went over to Harley's for a barbecue. Their parents were good friends, I believe, and they messaged me on Instagram at around 8 p.m., asking if I wanted to go back to the abandoned house. I only lived about 2 streets away from them, so I said yes, and I went out to meet them. We gathered out front and made our way into the house through the back door. I was a bit nervous because we had never been in the house at night before, but with our flashlights on our phones, it seemed less scary with all 3 of us laughing and joking around. We entered the house and began our usual routine of looking for anything cool. We joked and made light of the situation, searching through old letters and boxes for anything worth taking home, or at least photographing. At some point, I started recording on my phone. I can't remember why exactly. We were all hanging out in the kitchen area when Harley was mid-joke, and all of a sudden, we heard multiple loud, rapid knocks from the floorboards directly below us. Without sparing each other so much as a glance, we each bolted out of the kitchen and through the back door. The back door led to a balcony and staircase, but I was in such a panic to get out of that house that I jumped off the balcony and landed on my rear. But I didn't care at the time. We scrambled over each other, trying to get back to the main road, and once we did, we went straight home. The next day we talked about it at school. It all seemed hilarious now that it was daytime, and we laughed about how I had jumped off the balcony and bruised my rear. We never did go back into the house, despite still walking past it on our way home from school. I still had that video on my phone, and you can hear the knocks in it. I did upload it to YouTube somewhere, but I will need to look through my old accounts to see if I can find it. A few years ago, my brother and I embarked on a 15-hour overnight drive across 3 provinces in Canada to meet up with our parents and other family members at our grandmother's house. It was summer, and that year, heavy rain had caused flooding on many of the roads. Consequently, we had to divert from our usual route along the Trans-Canada Highway and took some rural roads we had never driven before on this trip, despite having made the journey many times. In the middle of Saskatchewan, at about 2-3 a.m., we found ourselves on a road called Louis Riel Trail. We both noticed and commented to each other about how deserted it was, hoping that the roads weren't closed or redirected ahead. It felt as if the road was completely abandoned, but since it wasn't the main highway, we thought that might explain the lack of other vehicles. As we continued, we began to see dead deer along the sides of the road. Quite a few, in fact. I remember saying something about hoping we wouldn't hit one. Suddenly, we drove for a solid 5 to 10 minutes on a stretch of road where both sides were absolutely covered in deer. Literal piles of dead deer were stacked on top of each other, mangled together, their eyes open and shining in the headlights. They were clearly deceased, twisted up in strange positions, with necks bent awkwardly and feet pointing skyward. Strangely, none were in the middle of the road. There were no splattered bodies, no blood or gore, just hundreds of intact dead deer lining and piling on both sides of the road. I remember just staring at them, occasionally glancing over at the dead piles on the other side, and one of us remarked about being trapped between walls of dead deer. It sounds completely bizarre, but my brother remembers it too. We felt like we were in a daze. In hindsight, it should have really freaked us out, but I just recall staring at them, their eyes shining back at me. It felt like they were all looking at me, wondering why there were so many of them, why no one else was around. Yet they were silent, and we mindlessly drove through for several minutes. It wasn't until we passed them and began to see other vehicles and semi-trucks passing by again that we sort of snapped out of it and said, "That was really strange. What was that?" I had been taking photos throughout the trip. Random clouds, cows in the field, my feet on the dashboard. But for some reason, I never thought to take a picture of that bizarre road lined with dead deer. It felt like I wasn't thinking clearly when it happened. My brother and I talk about this often. It still bothers us because we both remember how weird it was. However, when we share the story with others, it never seems to convey the absurdity. We don't think people believe it happened. Yet we both witnessed it and felt the same thing. When I was about 15, I spent a lot of time just walking around the downtown area with my friends. Largely, this was a very uneventful pastime, as we were in a small New England city. However, this one time, things got a little weird. It was mid-afternoon, and I was with two other friends of the same age, another girl and a boy. I read a lot of spy books as a kid, and had it in my head that I could be some sort of secret agent, so I always had my head on a swivel when I was out, making sure I wasn't being tailed. As you can imagine, it was rarely an issue for me, seeing as I was not an undercover secret agent, except for this day when it was. I had noticed earlier an older white gentleman carrying a massive black sports duffel bag, and it stuck in my head because of how strange he looked. He was dressed in relatively nice business casual, and he had this huge bag slung over his shoulder that looked pretty full. He was walking toward us on the other side of the street when I first saw him. Then, a few blocks later, I turned and saw him behind us on our side of the street. He was still walking, following at about a block's distance. I mentioned to my friends, "Hey, do you see this guy? It kind of feels like he's following us." And they agreed that the vibe was weird. So we started testing him. We took this crazy route all over that part of town, walking for like half an hour. We were backtracking, zigzagging, and crossing the street back and forth, and this guy was copying our every move from a block behind. Eventually, we found ourselves across from the library, and at that point, we were feeling thoroughly spooked. We ran inside and hid in the magazine section because the way the stacks were set up allowed us to see the front door while being concealed from view. We weren't sure if we were being dramatic and imagining that the guy was following us. I mean, maybe he was also walking an erratic route around town with no end goal. But when we saw him walk in through the door, all doubt was gone. He came in, poked around the entrance area, clearly could not see us, and then left. We just about peed ourselves. We waited a long time before we left in case he was outside, and then hightailed it back to my friend's house. Weird day. Broad daylight, and one old guy following three athletic teenagers. I think someone tried to kidnap me once. I was walking home from work at 1 a.m., down the back alleys of a notoriously seedy gay area in London, behind the 24-hour clubs full of substance users on 72-hour weekend benders. A brand new black Land Rover pulled up to me. The passenger window came down, and a guy asked me if I could dance. I know, right? I laughed and said no. He said something to the driver, and they crept up to me. He told me there was a dancing competition he could take me to if I wanted to make some money. I said no, and kept walking. The car stopped, allowing me to get maybe 20 meters ahead, but then it came back up to me pretty fast. This time, the driver rolled down his window and told me to get in the car, otherwise something bad will happen. I ran, and the car chased me. Screeching tires like a bad 80s movie. Luckily, I knew the area like the back of my hand and made a couple of nifty turns through some alleys that cars couldn't access. I lived close by and managed to get home just fine. My boyfriend was waiting up for me, and I walked into the house as if nothing had happened. I don't know why I never said anything. It just sounded like a stupid story. In hindsight, I am sure they thought I was a little substance user pouring out of the club. I am also certain the person in the back of the car was someone notable. The car was out of place and swanky, and the guy driving was clearly a driver. There's a whole sleazy world out there, coexisting and going under the radar. I tell this story whenever I get the chance because it's such an interesting one. I used to live on an old farm where the farmhand's quarters had been made into a rental apartment. We felt a strong and unwelcoming presence in the apartment at night, along with strange movements. But the most impressive experience was the ghost of a horse. After living there for some time, the owner renovated the old stables to be rented out for horses. Shortly after, 3 horses took up residency there, and not long after that, we heard it for the first time. At around 8 p.m., we heard a horse walk into the courtyard. We both jumped up and ran out, believing a horse had gotten loose. I ran to the stables while my ex ran out to look for the horse. When he rapidly pulled open the door to the stables, I saw 3 shocked horses looking at me with puzzled expressions. My ex hadn't seen anything either, so we shrugged and went back to bed. The next day, it happened again. This time, we ran to the windows and looked out from both sides. Nothing. Only the vaguely lit darkness. A couple of days went by before we heard it again, and we got used to it, accepting it as the spirit of a horse coming to visit its friends. It kept happening at random throughout the time we lived there, but always around 8 p.m. Even our neighbor, who was a stern, non-spiritual mechanic, heard it and completely lost her mind when she found out we had heard it too. A while later, we learned that the farm had burned down many years ago, and we assumed the poor horse had perished then. When new horses suddenly arrived, it found some new friends. It's not as spooky as most of the stories here, but it's one of the weirdest things that has ever happened to me, seared into my memory. I was a teenager and had my driver's permit. It was the weekend, and my mom had some errands to run. Knowing I needed the driving hours, she invited me along so I could drive. I was close to getting my license, so I was already comfortable in the driver's seat, and there were no jitters. I pulled out of the garage, and before I even got out of the driveway, I stomped on the brakes. I couldn't explain it, but I turned to my mom and said we shouldn't go. Without missing a beat, she said I was right. I don't know what happened. Divine intervention? Maybe? I'm a very practical person, but I can't think of any psychological or scientific reason why that dreadful feeling hit me like a freight train out of nowhere and made me stop in my tracks. Nothing like that has happened to me since. I often wonder what would have happened if we had left. When I was about 10 to 12 years old, I was afraid of the dark and had trouble sleeping. I was always tired. Sometimes, my mom came to my room at night just to check if I was asleep. One night, I was just about to fall asleep when I saw my mom standing next to my window, looking out. Except it wasn't my mom. She had short hair, and this someone else had long hair. I didn't see their face because it was dark, but when they turned around and looked at me, I felt horror I'd never felt before. Not because they were somehow frightening, but because I felt a wave of kindness and concern from them. I suddenly knew they had always been watching. Being a kid, I just hid under my blanket and waited. Nothing happened. There was no one there when I finally checked. Well, I thought I was hallucinating from being so tired and half asleep, but it happened again and again. always different people. They were just checking on me, not wishing anything bad. But one of them was a bit irritated because I could see them. They said, not out loud, I just knew it in my head, that I shouldn't be staying in that room. They were like, "It's obviously not good for you to spend the night on this route." I later changed rooms with my sister. Not for that reason. I never told a soul. I was not a trusting kid, and I was pretty sure everyone would think I was crazy. They never came to that other room. I started to sleep better. Sometimes, when I got up at night to have a glass of water or something, I felt this presence saying, "See? I told you that was not a place for you." I swear that I'm a pretty serious person and do not believe in anything supernatural. But I have no explanation for this. I was trying to sleep on some kind of pathway for spirits, I guess. They didn't bother my sister, or maybe she just didn't tell anyone either. I love all things spooky, and as a photographer, urban decay interests me a lot as a subject. I got overnight tickets, 11 p.m. 6 a.m., to tour an abandoned insane asylum. It was open to the public for tours, history lessons, and whatnot. The place had basically been abandoned overnight and had a history of violent patients, overcrowding to 3 times its intended capacity, and malpractice, all the way back to when it started as a care clinic for the Civil War. It was partially renovated to follow safety guidelines, like old stairs and caving flooring, but the owners were set on preserving as much of the building as possible, from the furniture and doors to the faded nameplates on some rooms and half-erased chalkboards. I'd like to preface this by saying that before this, I didn't really believe in ghosts, but respected others' opinions. This night changed that. We were encouraged to do some exploring after the first half of the tour. The place has 4 floors with multiple wards, so a lot of walking was anticipated, and I distinctly remember everyone wearing sneakers or athletic shoes, even the guide. You know, the kind that are usually quiet with rubber soles. After the group split up to explore, I ventured into a ward with a heavy, screechy steel door to take some photos of the previously mentioned chalkboards and other items. The only way in and out of the ward was that door. The end of the ward was the end of the wing. It was dead silent. As I stepped into a cell room to take photos, I heard the crisp, echoing sound of boots walking on the hardwood flooring from the hall. The sound was making its way towards me at a slightly slower than normal walking pace from the direction of the heavy door. I don't think I've ever been so frozen in fear in my life. The ward was empty of my fellow tourists. I checked each room when I made my way to the end, and I had no idea who could be in there with me. After about 7 seconds, the sound abruptly stopped midway down the hall, and I peeked my head out of the room. No one was there. After calming down and not panicking, I searched every room in that ward, but there was not a soul in sight. No screeching or thudding came from the door. There's absolutely no way anyone came in or out. I'm convinced the ghost of an old resident doctor or a guard haunts those halls and slowly paces up and down. When I was younger, we lived way out in the country, over 20 minutes from town. The nearest neighbor, at the time of the story, was a solid 7-minute drive away, and then another 10 minutes to the next neighbor. It was mostly fields and grasslands. My parents operated a family practice at the time and often worked late. My dad worked more so because he was a surgeon and was on call most of the time. About mid-afternoon during the summer, a car pulled up to the house. We had a longish drive leading up to the house with a circle built out in the front. It could probably park 9 cars side by side comfortably, meant to host events like hunting challenges, etc. Fun times. But this car parked, and out came 2 women, a younger woman, maybe in her 20s, and an older woman, probably in her 40s. I was young, and my memory is fuzzy, so they might be skewed. Keep that in mind. So, 2 strangers were now on the property. I was young enough to listen to adults no matter what because God says so, but old enough to have basic survival instincts. They rang the doorbell a bit, but I hid in my room. A few minutes passed, and they paced the front porch. Then they got back in their car and drove further down our drive to pass the barn, the dog shed, and the run. flipping back around before the cattle guard that leads to our main grazing pasture and pond. They drove behind a tree line where my dad kept the pheasants and finally returned to the front of the house. They got out again and came up to the door, ringing the doorbell some more. At this point, I figured they had to know my parents or something. So, my foolish self came down the stairs and approached the door. We had the normal tornado-resistant storm door, with a thick bolt and a door stopper. A thick metal U-shaped bit fit under the doorknob and pressed at a 45-degree angle against the door. Our main point of entry was through the garage door into a mudroom. Farm work is dirty work. The younger woman grinned at me through the window beside the door and started talking. They just wanted to come in and discuss God, spread His message. The older woman was standing back, staring at the front of our drive. We had one way in and out of the property, and you could see dust trails from cars for miles. "Just open the door, honey, we brought some snacks too." I shook my head and, like a complete fool, said my parents weren't home. The younger woman continued to insist that I let them in, and I was conflicted. I had been taught that godly folks are good and that I should obey them. What the church had failed to teach was stranger danger. But I didn't let them in. Eventually, the older woman started mumbling to the younger woman. The younger woman was getting angry and began to tell me I'd be punished by God if I didn't let them in. Now I was getting scared. I never handled being yelled at well. The older woman grabbed the younger woman's arm and tugged on it. The younger woman rolled her eyes, and the pair left, peeling out of the driveway. I remember standing there, staring at the driveway for several minutes. I don't remember why. I was just staring, as if they might come back, or someone else was coming to rescue me from the tense situation. No one did. When I told my mom what had happened on the landline a few minutes later, she said, "Why didn't you let them in, son?" In hindsight, she was exhausted from work and not thinking straight. The stress made me finally break down sobbing because I thought I had done something really bad. Later that night, after dinner, we hugged and talked about it. In the end, I must have had a big imagination, or didn't recognize some ladies from our church, which I would have, since we attended a small church. Now that I'm an adult and a listener of a few true crime podcasts, I think those women were trying to either abduct me or steal something from the house. Or they had the wrong house. It's hard to tell. But I think they patrolled the property looking for me. Sometimes Dad would give me work to do while they were away, like clearing parts of the pasture or moving some scrap metal. Easy things I could handle on my own for a few bucks at a time. I didn't feel safe for a very long time until I could defend myself. I've developed some nasty memory loss, so a lot of details are gone. I barely remember the car, and I couldn't tell you either woman's hair color. But, wow, I remember the fear. In 2011, I was a 9th grade transferee to a new school, and my classmates were telling me that this one kid from another section, who I'll just call Jack, was a bit weird. They said that he had a strange experience where he saw his reflection from a computer monitor in reverse. By reverse, I meant not how we normally see ourselves in the mirror. I thought they were just fooling around and making up stories until the year after, in 10th grade, when I saw the same thing. Jack became my classmate, and we became friends. He was actually a funny person and a joker in class. One day, we were in the canteen, and I took out a small pocket mirror to fix my hair. Jack sat beside me, and when I looked at him through my mirror, I was incredibly creeped out because I saw his reflection in reverse. I didn't say a word to him because I was shocked. After a few minutes, I looked at him again through my mirror, and his reflection became normal. I just let it go and didn't let it ruin our friendship, but whenever I think of the experience I had in 2012, it still gives me the creeps because I have no idea what kind of sorcery or curse it was. Sadly, Jack passed away in 2020 due to a heart attack. He was a nice guy.